France, August 1944. The night hums with engines, headlights are hooded. Only a faint red glow marks the endless line. Truck after truck grinding through the ruins of Normandy. Diesel fumes hang heavy in the air. Mud splatters up the sides of olive drab cabs inside. Young drivers stare ahead into the dark. Hands tight on the wheel, eyes burning from fatigue behind them. The front waits. Patton's tank stalled for want of fuel. Ahead, the roads twist through shattered villages, broken bridges, and ambush country. There is no radio chatter. No margin for error. One breakdown can halt the line for miles. Every mile forward feeds the army's heartbeat. Gasoline, ammunition, rations. Without them, the momentum of victory dies. They were mocked when the idea began. A rolling supply line stretching across France. Built from chaos and desperation, even some generals doubted it could last a week. But in that smoky night, under the thunder of 10,000 engines, a new kind of warfare was being born, one driven not by glory, but by grit and motion. Their route began as an answer to a question: how do you feed a war on wheels? By the summer of 1944, Europe was burning its way toward liberation. The Allied armies had finally broken out of the Normandy beachhead after weeks of brutal hedgerow fighting. The success of Operation Cobra in late July had shattered the German front, sending the Wehrmacht into chaotic retreat across France for the first time since D-Day. The roads ahead were open, and General George S. Patton intended to use them. His newly formed U.S. Third Army, unleashed on August 1st, was a weapon of speed and aggression. In a matter of weeks, Patton's armored divisions surged across Brittany, cutting through enemy positions and encircling pockets of resistance. His tanks advanced so rapidly that even senior commanders struggled to keep track of their positions. But victory was a hungry machine. Every Sherman tank drank hundreds of gallons of fuel a day. Every division required thousands of tons of ammunition, spare parts, and rations. The faster Patton's men moved, the more fuel they burned, and the longer the supply line stretched. The ports of Normandy, still shattered from invasion, were the only entry points for supplies. The great harbors of Cherbourg and Le Havre remained half-ruined, choked with wreckage each day. Thousands of tons of cargo arrived on the beaches: fuel drums, crates, vehicles. But there was no efficient way to push it inland in August alone. Allied forces in France required over 20,000 tons of supplies every day. Patton's Third Army alone demanded nearly a third of that. Yet the trucks available could only deliver a fraction. The railways of northern France, bombed relentlessly by Allied aircraft before D-Day, were now little more than twisted metal in craters. Bridges were down, tracks were unusable. The Army's great logistical chain, carefully planned on paper, collapsed under the reality of war as the spearheads advanced. Fuel convoys crawled behind, often delayed for days. By mid-August, Patton's tanks began running dry on the road. Crews siphoned gasoline from disabled vehicles just to reach the next town. Commanders radioed for resupply, but there was none to give for all its firepower. The Third Army faced its most dangerous enemy: distance in the quiet backrooms of Allied headquarters. Panic began to spread. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, watched as the front advanced faster than his supply columns could follow. He realized that if the pace continued, Patton's forces could stall completely, or worse, be cut off deep inside France. The Allied High Command had faced logistical challenges before, but nothing on this scale in the Pacific. Island bases could be supplied by sea in Italy. Advances were slow and measured, but in France, mobility itself had become the strategy. The army that moved the fastest would win, and that meant supply had to move faster still. It was Patton who put it bluntly. "My men can eat their belts," he told his staff, "but my tanks gotta have gas." The answer would not come from generals, but from the rank and file: mechanics, truck drivers, engineers, and logisticians, men who rarely saw the front line. yet whose work determined whether the front could even exist. The heart of this effort stood the Motor Transport Corps, a vast, improvised network of vehicles and personnel tasked with keeping the Allied war machine moving. But even they were overwhelmed. France's roads, still littered with wreckage, could barely handle the volume of traffic pouring across them, convoys tangled in bottlenecks that stretched for miles. The solution would have to be radical, a single, massive operation devoted entirely to supply a lifeline of trucks running day and night. Feeding the front without pause. It would be the most ambitious logistical experiment of the war, a gamble to keep momentum alive, and at its heart, an army within the army, thousands of drivers, many of them young, untested, and from units that had never before been trusted with such responsibility. They were told it couldn't be done, that the roads would collapse under the strain, that the men would fail, they would prove everyone wrong. The idea began not in a boardroom, but in crisis. By late August 1944, the Allied advance had outpaced its own shadow. Every division that moved forward stretched the supply chain another mile. Thinner fuel dumps were emptying faster than they could be refilled. The front was on the verge of halting, not because of German resistance, but because of logistics. At the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, planners studied maps covered in red pencil lines showing fuel routes and delivery zones. One name kept surfacing: Patton. His Third Army had become both the pride and the problem of the Allied campaign. Unstoppable, yet unsustainable. General John C.H. Lee, head of the Communication Zone, COMZ, faced the impossible. He needed to move 350,000 tons of supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. Each month railroads were still in ruins. Airlift capacity was limited, and pipelines hadn't yet been built. There's only one solution: trucks. So, on August 25, 1944, Cons issued an order that would change the shape of the campaign. All available vehicles were to be organized into a continuous, round-the-clock convoy system, a rolling highway of supply that would never stop moving. The code name: the Red Ball Express. The name came from an old American railroad term, Red Ball. Trains were priority lines that carried vital freight under constant clearance. On paper, the plan was simple. In practice, it was madness. Over 6,000 vehicles, mostly 2.5-ton GMC, deuce-and-a-half trucks, would form a one-way loop: supplies up, empty trucks back. The route ran from Normandy to Chartres, then east toward Paris and the front at Reims, stretching over 700 kilometers to prevent chaos. 2 parallel roads were designated, one for eastbound loaded convoys, one for returning traffic. The route would be open 24 hours a day, guarded, patrolled, and cleared by military police. Drivers were forbidden to stop except for emergencies. The convoys would run like arteries, unbroken, unstoppable. What made the Red Ball Express extraordinary wasn't just its scale, it was who drove it. Of the 23,000 personnel assigned to the operation, roughly 75% were African American soldiers from the U.S. Army's segregated quartermaster truck companies. These men had been trained for support roles, not glory. They were often underestimated, even ignored. Yet when the call came, they stepped forward. They drove through exhaustion, enemy fire, and prejudice. Men whose courage would never be recorded in communiques, but whose effort kept entire armies alive. Each truck carried up to 5 tons of cargo, mostly fuel, ammunition, and food. The convoys ran with headlights blacked out, guided only by the faint glow of cat's eye reflectors. Drivers learned to steer by instinct and memory. Breakdowns were constant. Tires shredded by shrapnel and rubble. Mechanics worked along the roadside under the dim glow of flashlights, repairing engines as artillery thundered in the distance. Accidents were frequent. Trucks overturned, bridges collapsed, engines overheated, yet the convoys kept moving. On average, more than 900 vehicles were on the road at any given hour. At its peak, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies per day, enough to feed Patton's advance across France. Without it, the Third Army's armor would have stood still. The system became a marvel of improvisation. Commanders learned to adapt on the fly, rerouting around destroyed bridges, creating makeshift repair yards, and using captured German fuel trucks when American ones failed. The road became a living organism, constantly in motion, constantly consuming and renewing itself for the men behind the wheel. It was a test of endurance. Many drove for 16 to 20 hours straight, sleeping in their cabs, eating cold rations, dodging air attacks and snipers. They were ordered to maintain convoys at 50-yard intervals. But fatigue and terrain often turned the roads into chaos. Miles of honking horns, grinding gears, and shouting sergeants. The line held. The supplies reached the front to the outside observer. It was just logistics, boxes, barrels, fuel drums. But to the men of the Red Ball Express, it was life and death. Every can of gasoline, every crate of ammunition meant another tank moving, another battle fought in the chaos of liberation. As Allied troops rolled through France's ruined towns, the Red Ball trucks became familiar sights, dust-caked, dented. Their drivers waving to civilians as they passed. French villagers called them les camions rouges, the red trucks, for the bright insignia painted on their windshields, a scarlet circle marking them as part of the lifeline behind them. Other convoys began to form: Blue Ball, Green Diamond, but none would match the speed, spirit, or impact of the Red Ball Express. It had become more than an operation. It was momentum made real, and as the road eastward lengthened, so too did the legend. Each delivery brought Patton closer to his goal, and closer to the moment when logistics itself would decide the fate of his campaign. They called them truck drivers, but in truth, they were soldiers on a different kind of front. Most were barely 20 years old. Many had never driven a vehicle before the war. When they were handed the keys to the massive GMC 2.5-ton truck, some had to learn in the mud fields of Normandy, grinding gears until they mastered the rhythm of steel and diesel. For the African-American drivers of the Red Ball Express, the mission was more than duty. It was proof that they could do what others said they couldn't. At a time when the U.S. Army remained segregated, their performance would speak louder than any speech. They drove day and night, through rain, shellfire, and exhaustion. There was no rest. The rule was simple: keep 'em rolling. One driver later recalled, "We didn't have no headlights, no sleep, and no glory, just a job that had to be done." They faced not just enemy fire, but systemic doubt. Officers who questioned their ability, locals who stared in disbelief, mechanics who didn't think they'd last a week. But as the convoys grew and the supplies flowed, something began to shift. Those same skeptics started to salute as the trucks thundered passed by. Mid-September 1944. The Red Ball Express had become the arteries of the Allied advance for every tank that roared into Germany. There were 20 trucks behind it, each carrying the fuel that made its movement possible. It was human endurance turned into a supply line. George S. Patton understood better than most that wars aren't won by glory, they're won by gasoline. By the time his Third Army broke out from Normandy, his tanks were racing so fast that maps became outdated within hours. He expected miracles from his men and from his supply line. The Red Ball Express became the living nerve, connecting his ambition to reality. Patton demanded 400,000 gallons of fuel a day when told that supplies were short. He refused to slow down. "My men can eat their belts," he snapped, "but my tanks have got to have gas for the Red Ball Express." That order was both a burden and a badge of honor. The drivers knew that if they failed, the advance stopped. EOMZ officers adjusted schedules, prioritized routes, and rerouted entire convoys around destroyed bridges just to keep up with Patton's pace. Some truck companies ran continuous relays, drivers sleeping only when another took the wheel. When weather turned the roads to rivers of mud, They chained tires and pushed forward when Luftwaffe strafers appeared. They scattered into fields, then regrouped to continue the run. Patton later admitted that without the Red Ball Express, his campaign across France would have collapsed within days. Fuel they carried was more than logistics, it was the oxygen of his strategy. Behind every victorious column of Sherman tanks lay the dust cloud of the Red Ball. The Red Ball Express was not just movement, it was a military innovation. At its heart lay a principle that modern armies still live by. Logistical supremacy equals operational freedom. Every convoy was a tactical element in itself. Planners established checkpoints, radio frequencies, and maintenance depots every 20 miles. Military police patrolled the routes, keeping the flow constant and clearing wrecks within minutes. Fuel depots were positioned with mathematical precision to minimize downtime. The system was fluid. Alive, a single road might see 5,000 trucks in a single day. All coordinated without digital technology, only maps, dispatchers, and discipline. Tactical genius of the Red Ball Express was its continuity. Supplies didn't move in fits and starts. They pulsed like blood through veins. This steady rhythm meant Patton's advance could maintain tempo, striking before the Germans could regroup. German commanders, stunned by the Allies' speed, believed the Americans had discovered some new method of resupply. In a sense, they had one powered by speed, improvisation, and the raw will of thousands of men who refused to stop even. Eisenhower recognized the operation's brilliance. He wrote that the Red Ball Express exemplified American ingenuity at its finest, turning impossible distances into manageable routes. Yet, behind the charts and success reports lay the constant danger of collapse. Every broken truck, every missed delivery, every ambushed convoy risked halting the entire front. The line had no redundancy. It survived on motion alone. In that relentless pace lay both its genius and its fragility. As September rolled on, the Red Ball Express grew to legendary scale. New routes branched east toward Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Siegfried Line. The convoys became so numerous that French civilians stood by the roadside for hours just to watch them thunder past. A moving wall of steel and determination. But not everyone shared the same recognition. Despite their crucial role, many of the African-American drivers returned home with little more than exhaustion and pride. Their service went largely unacknowledged in official reports still. Their contribution endured, carved into the memory of every soldier who ate, fired, or drove. Because of those endless convoys, the Red Ball Express had become the invisible backbone of victory, a feat of coordination that turned chaos into velocity. And as autumn deepened, a new challenge emerged, one that would test not just endurance, but adaptability. Because what happens when speed outruns its own supply? When Patton's Third Army raced east across France, it wasn't just tanks and infantry that defined the new face of war. It was the machine behind them. Red Ball Express represented one of the most ambitious uses of motorized logistics in history. The heart of it lay in the GMCCK, 2.5-ton truck, the workhorse of the Allied war machine. Known simply as the Deuce and a Half, it was rugged, simple, and reliable. Its inline-six engine could take punishment. Its frame could bear almost any load, and its parts could be replaced with a wrench and a hammer. But keeping thousands of these trucks running wasn't simple. The convoys burned through 300,000 gallons of fuel daily, often hauling the same fuel they would consume. Tires shredded, engines overheated, transmissions locked from overuse. Mechanics worked in ditches under fire, replacing clutches by flashlight to keep the system alive. Engineers built rolling maintenance depots, mobile fuel farms, and field workshops that traveled with the convoys. Army engineers laid pontoon bridges overnight and built bypass roads where bridges had been bombed out. In a single day, they could rebuild a route that would have taken civilians weeks. It was improvisation elevated to engineering. The Red Ball Express became a machine that repaired itself while moving, a living organism made of steel, oil, and willpower. This mechanical resilience allowed the Allies to transform a battered French countryside into a functioning highway system under combat conditions. For every Sherman that fired a round in Germany, there was a truck somewhere behind it hauling the shell that made it possible. And as the convoys rolled onward, another observer began to take notice: the German high command. At first, the Wehrmacht laughed. Allied logistics were the butt of German jokes. They saw the Americans as lavish and wasteful, soldiers who brought too much, ate too well, and relied on machines instead of endurance. But by late August 1944, that laughter faded. German intelligence officers tracking the Allied advance were stunned. The American front was moving faster than any supply theory allowed. Every captured depot, every abandoned truck revealed the same painted insignia: a red bull. Soon, German aircraft began to target these convoys, recognizing them for what they were: the true arteries of Allied power. Luftwaffe pilots dove on open roads, raking lines of trucks with cannon fire. But the Red Ball Express adapted quickly. Convoys split into smaller packets, changed routes daily, and drove mostly at night. Camouflage and discipline became as vital as engines. Drivers learned to spot ambush, to swerve off-road, to fight back when attacked. The Germans never managed to break the system. For every convoy destroyed, 3 more appeared. Captured German officers later admitted that they were bewildered by the speed of the American advance, not because of tactics, but because of supply. One intelligence report concluded grimly: the enemy possesses an inexhaustible capacity to move. The Red Ball Express had done more than feed Patton's tanks. It had shattered German assumptions about what mobility meant in modern warfare. And yet, behind that achievement lay an irony: the same soldiers who had kept the army alive still fought for recognition. Within it, the Red Ball Express was born in a segregated army. Nearly 75% of its drivers and mechanics were African American, men assigned to service units because regulations barred them from most combat roles. Their work was essential, yet invisible. Newspapers back home rarely mentioned them. Official communiques spoke of supply efficiency, never of the men who risked their lives to make it happen. Racism shadowed their service. White officers sometimes doubted their discipline or questioned their courage. But on the road, under fire, those doubts dissolved. Courage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was measured in miles driven, under threat of death. Many of these men came from the rural South. They had grown up fixing tractors, hauling timber, working endless days in fields. That hard-earned skill translated perfectly to the brutal mechanics of military trucking in the mud of France. They became indispensable. Yet, when they returned home after the war, most found the same segregated buses, the same divided towns, the same silence about their service. But history would not forget. Decades later, their legacy would be recognized for what it was: not just a logistical achievement, but a moral triumph. They proved that patriotism was not measured by privilege, but by perseverance. They had carried the fuel of freedom, even when that freedom was not fully theirs. The Red Ball Express was more than an operation. It was a symbol of ingenuity, resilience, and the quiet heroism that sustains victory. But by late 1944, that heroism was being stretched to its limit. The roads grew longer, the weather colder, and the distances between depots and front lines wider than ever. Trucks broke down by the thousands. Bridges washed out. The miracle of speed began to crack under its own weight. The Red Ball Express had pushed the limits of logistics. Now, those limits were beginning to push back, and the moment came, inevitable, dramatic, and defining, when the fuel finally ran dry. By early September 1944, the miracle of movement had reached its limit. Patton's tanks, which had raced nearly 400 miles from Normandy to the Meuse River, now stood silent. Fuel drums ran dry, engines sputtered, and armored columns sat stranded in the French countryside. The advance that had seemed unstoppable had been choked not by German fire, but by distance. The Red Ball Express had carried the war on its shoulders. But the burden had grown impossible. Every gallon of gasoline had to travel from the beaches of Normandy, through Cherbourg, across temporary depots, then up improvised highways hundreds of miles long. What had begun as a desperate improvisation was now a logistical nightmare in the fields near Verdun. Soldiers gathered around their immobilized tanks. Patton himself stood fuming beside a stalled convoy. His Third Army, the spearhead of the Allied drive, was paralyzed. The general's temper was legendary, but this was different. This was the first time his momentum had been defeated, not by the enemy, but by the very physics of supply. The Allied command knew the Red Ball Express couldn't sustain the pace forever. The numbers were brutal every day. The trucks consumed roughly 300,000 gallons of gasoline just to deliver 800,000 gallons to the front. Roads designed for local traffic now carried up to 6,000 vehicles daily. Tearing apart the French infrastructure, bridges collapsed under constant strain. Tires shredded faster than replacements could arrive, the farther the front advanced. The longer the routes became, stretching beyond 500 miles, drivers now spent 16 to 20 hours behind the wheel, often sleeping inside their cabs for lack of time to rest. Maintenance crews worked without pause. Mechanics rebuilt engines in the mud, cannibalized broken trucks for spare parts, and refilled fuel drums straight from tank cars. Yet even with every trick and shortcut, the math no longer added up by mid-September. Warehouses near Cherbourg overflowed with supplies that could not be moved forward fast enough. The highways near Chartres and Dreux became parking lots of stranded vehicles, and in the east, the German army, though battered, was regrouping. Every lost day was an opportunity for them to dig in, reinforce, and prepare for counterattack. On September 3, 1944, General George S. Patton arrived at his forward headquarters near Verdun. His tanks were out of fuel, his men were exhausted, and his temper was volcanic. He slammed his riding crop against the hood of a jeep and barked to his staff, "Gasoline is the lifeblood of war. My army is dying of thirst." He was right. The entire Third Army, nearly 500,000 men, had ground to a halt. Patton had built his reputation on momentum. His philosophy was simple: strike fast, never stop, never give the enemy time to recover. But now, his speed had outrun the very logistics that made it possible. The irony was bitter. The same Red Ball Express that had carried him to victory in France was now the reason he could advance no further. He demanded priority fuel allocation from Supreme Headquarters, but Eisenhower faced the same dilemma across all fronts. Montgomery in the North needed fuel for Operation Market Garden. Bradley required it for the Ninth Army. And logistics officers warned that the ports could not unload fast enough to satisfy everyone in the end. Eisenhower had to choose. Patton's request was denied. His tanks would wait for the men of the Red Ball Express. The news hit like a gut punch. They had driven night and day, risking their lives to feed Patton's fire. And now the fire was going cold. Convoys didn't stop completely. They couldn't even in crisis. The Red Ball Express continued to run, but at a fraction of its earlier strength. Trucks limped along cratered roads, headlights off, engines coughing from overused drivers, navigated by starlight and instinct. Train turned the dirt highways into rivers of mud. Axles snapped, engines seized still. They drove because stopping wasn't an option. In one convoy near Reims, a truck overturned on a sharp bend, spilling gasoline across the road. The driver, a young private from Alabama, was trapped beneath the cab. His comrades pulled him free as German artillery shells began to fall. Instead of fleeing, they righted the truck, patched the fuel line, and drove on. Such moments never made the official reports, but they were the essence of the Red Ball story: determination without witness, sacrifice without spotlight. The entire operation hung by a thread of human endurance, and though the line never truly broke, It bent to the point of collapse. By late September, the Red Ball Express had become both a triumph and a warning, a symbol of how far American ingenuity could stretch, and how fragile that stretch could be. Battle for France was shifting again, and in the command tents of Allied headquarters, a new debate began to rage. How could they maintain an army of 1 million men across a continent still scarred by war? The answer would demand transformation, a turning point that would change the shape of Allied logistics forever in war. Every triumph demands adaptation. By late September 1944, the Allied advance had outrun its lifelines. Patton's tanks were still hungry for fuel. Eisenhower's staff pored over maps and railway charts, searching for a miracle. That miracle came, not from the front lines, but from the rear. The men who had built the Red Ball Express refused to accept defeat. Military engineers, logisticians, and truck drivers came together to rebuild the arteries of war from the ground up. If the roads could not bear the burden, they would make new ones. The first step was to open the ports. The beaches of Normandy had served their purpose, but the bottleneck was killing the advance. Cherbourg was operational, but its facilities were too small to handle the incoming flood of supplies. The Allies needed a major harbor, and fast their eyes turned north to Antwerp, captured by the British in early September. The port of Antwerp was one of Europe's largest, capable of unloading tens of thousands of tons of cargo a day. But its access route, the Scheldt estuary, remained under German control. Mines, artillery, and fortified islands blocked passage until Antwerp could be cleared. Every gallon of gasoline, every crate of ammunition, still had to cross France by truck, while British and Canadian forces fought bitterly in the Scheldt campaign. The Americans focused on rebuilding their own logistical network. New depots were established near Chartres, Reims, and Verdun. Temporary railways were laid on old German lines, their ties patched with scavenged wood, but rail alone couldn't close the gap. It was the truck, the humble 2.5-ton GMC Deuce and a Half, that remained the soul of the operation. By now, the Red Ball Express had changed. The first wild weeks of nonstop movement were over. What remained was endurance, the quiet, relentless grind of keeping an army alive. The drivers, many of them African-American soldiers who had once been assigned to labor units, had become experts of the impossible. They knew which bridges could bear a fully loaded truck, which shortcuts cut hours off the journey, and which towns hid friendly locals who offered hot food when rations ran out. They had learned to repair engines with wire, to patch fuel leaks with tin, and to drive half-blind through fog and blackout. In one report from late 1944, a logistics officer wrote simply, "These men drive until the wheels come off, then they carry the wheels." The Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was a brotherhood forged in exhaustion and faith, and their perseverance paid off. By October, daily deliveries had stabilized again. The depots were fuller, the supply lines more secure. The front began to stir. At the heart of this resurgence was a single solution: the pipeline under pressure, or PLUT, originally designed to carry fuel under the English Channel from Britain to France. The system was now extended inland, a network of flexible steel pipelines running alongside roads and rivers, feeding forward fuel depots. For the first time, the Red Ball trucks were not alone. They were joined by liquid columns of gasoline flowing unseen beneath the earth. The combination of truck convoys, restored railways, and the Pluto network transformed the Allied logistics web from desperation to dominance. By November 1944, supplies reached the front faster than ever before. Patton's Third Army roared back to life, surging eastward toward the Saar and the German border. The engines thundered once more, but victory brought new challenges as autumn turned to winter. The roads of northern France froze. Solid ice clung to the windshields. Diesel engines refused to start. The German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, erupted in December. And suddenly, every truck, every gallon, every driver was vital again. The Red Ball Express, which had been officially discontinued in mid-November, was reborn in spirit. Convoys reformed under new names: the White Ball, the Green Diamond, the XYZ Run, each one rushing fuel, ammunition, and men to the frozen front lines. Some trucks carried jerrycans strapped 3 high. Others hauled artillery shells across snow-choked valleys. Drivers wrapped themselves in blankets. Driving with gloves stiff from frost, their routes were perilous, bombed and strafed by German aircraft. But they drove anyway, because the Army had no other choice in those weeks. The lessons of the Red Ball Express proved their worth: the discipline, the endurance, the sheer human will that had once fed Patton's advance now sustained the entire Allied front through the worst winter of the war. Early 1945. The logistical miracle was complete. The ports of Antwerp and Le Havre were fully operational. Railways ran like veins across liberated France. Fuel depots stretched all the way to the Rhine. The trucks that had once been symbols of desperation were now part of a vast, coordinated machine, one capable of feeding millions of men and thousands of vehicles across an entire continent. When Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine in March 1945, it did so with full tanks, ample ammunition, and total confidence. The war that had once stalled for lack of fuel was now unstoppable. The Red Ball Express had carried the torch through the darkest phase, and in doing so, had rewritten the art of modern warfare. What began as improvisation had become doctrine. What began as desperation had become destiny. And yet, as victory loomed, the story of those who made it possible, the anonymous drivers, the mechanics, the engineers, faded quietly behind the headlines of triumph. The engines that once defined the front were falling silent again, but the echo of their roar would never be forgotten. When the guns finally quieted and the armies reached the Rhine, the headlines spoke of Generals Patton's dash across France, Eisenhower's grand strategy, Bradley's command, Montgomery's caution. But none of them could have moved without the men of the road. For months, they had lived behind the wheel, eating dust, sleeping in cabs, and pushing steel through storms. The Red Ball Express had been the pulse of the Allied advance. Yet when the war turned toward victory, its drivers were already fading into the background. They were not decorated like fighter aces or celebrated like infantry heroes. Most were reassigned quietly to other duties or sent home when their trucks wore out. Many never spoke of what they'd done, but in the records, in the dull columns of tonnage and distance, their achievement is undeniable. In just 81 days of full operation, the Red Ball Express delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, rations, medical gear, everything that kept an army of millions alive and moving. Single rail network or port operation in the European theater matched its speed or flexibility. Yet for many of the men who made it possible, recognition did not come. Over 75% of Red Ball drivers were African American, soldiers of the segregated transportation corps, often denied combat roles or command positions. They had been assigned to the trucks because the system said that was all they were fit for. But on those endless roads, they proved otherwise. They showed leadership in crisis, initiative under fire, and technical skill that kept the Army's lifeline intact. They operated under relentless pressure, often driving double shifts, sometimes 20 hours straight. Their reward, at war's end, was silence. When newspapers covered the liberation of Paris or the crossing of the Rhine, they rarely mentioned the men behind the wheel. Photographs of the Red Ball convoys appeared without names, just faceless lines of trucks beneath headlines that spoke of generals and strategy. Even within the Army, few awards reached the drivers themselves. Their service, critical as it was, remained overshadowed by combat glory. But the frontline soldiers knew: infantrymen who marched through liberated towns, tankers who charged into Germany, bomber crews who refueled from Red Ball tanks. They remembered. Many wrote home about the men who never stopped driving. For them, The Red Ball Express was more than logistics. It was the difference between moving forward and dying in place by spring 1945. The Red Ball Express was officially dissolved. Its mission was complete. Its roads reclaimed by normal supply routes, but for the men who had driven it. The transition back to ordinary life was not so easy. They returned home to a divided America, to barracks, buses, and neighborhoods still marked by segregation. The uniform that had commanded respect on the roads of France brought none in their own towns. Many veterans of the Red Ball Express never found recognition. Until decades later, some joined the early civil rights movements. Others built quiet lives, carrying memories of convoys through fog and gunfire that few could imagine. Colonel Loren Ayers, one of the logistics officers who oversaw the operation, later wrote, "No one will ever know how much we owed to those men. They didn't just deliver fuel, they delivered victory. It was true without the convoys. Patton's advance would have stalled in the fields of France without their persistence. The war in Europe might have dragged on for months longer. They were unsung soldiers of movement, men who fought not with rifles, but with endurance. The lessons they taught of speed, improvisation, and logistics under fire reshaped military doctrine after the war. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps was reorganized. Its practices refined using data and experiences from the Red Ball Express. The emphasis on mobile supply networks became standard in modern warfare decades later. The principles born on those French roads would guide operations from Korea to Iraq, wherever armies needed to move faster than their maps could keep up. But beneath the strategy, the memory remained human, of young men staring through dusty windshields, engines rattling, miles unending of columns that vanished into the dawn and returned under starlight. Carrying hope in steel drums, they had proven something far greater than the success of an operation. They had proven the power of endurance and the dignity of service. Unseen, the world had moved on. But the road they paved would remain invisible, perhaps, yet vital as ever. And in the quiet after victory, their story still hummed like an idling engine, waiting to be heard again in the years after victory. As Europe rebuilt and the world divided into new alliances, the Red Ball Express quietly faded into military archives. Its convoys no longer thundered through the French countryside, and its name appeared only in training manuals and dusty reports. Yet within those pages lay the blueprint of modern mobility, the logistical genius that had kept Patton's Third Army alive. Became a model for every army that followed. The lesson was simple but revolutionary: speed wins wars, but only if you can feed it. Before 1944, supply was considered a supporting role. After the Red Ball Express, it became a weapon in itself. The image of the American soldier was no longer just the infantryman with a rifle, but the driver, the mechanic, the dispatcher, the quartermaster, the unseen gears of a global machine. From Korea's frozen mountains to the burning deserts of Kuwait, armies would measure their strength not just in tanks or aircraft, but in how quickly they could move what those machines needed to fight. The Red Ball Express had written that doctrine in the dust of France. But beyond strategy, the Red Ball Express carried a deeper human legacy, one that would take years to bear fruit. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still segregated. Black and white soldiers served, fought, and died under different commands. The Red Ball Express, built on the backs of predominantly black drivers, stood as one of the most effective and essential units in the entire Allied campaign. Yet they had served under a system that refused to see them as equals. The irony was stark in the field. The trucks did not care who drove them. The fuel burned the same. The shells hit the same targets. And the convoy rolled forward only when every man did his job. Commanders began to notice officers who had once doubted the reliability of African American troops. Saw them perform impossible feats of endurance and discipline. Under fire, the statistics were undeniable. Efficiency, delivery rates, maintenance, and morale all exceeded expectations. in the quiet post-war evaluations. Some of these officers sent reports back to Washington, recommending the end of segregation in logistics and support units. Was a small ripple in a much larger tide, but a real one just 4 years later. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, formally integrating the U.S. Armed Forces. The Red Ball Express did not cause that order, but it had proven, beyond question, that unity worked. And prejudice weakened the machine of war. Those men who once drove under a divided flag had helped lay the road toward a united military in later decades. The Red Ball Express became part of American legend. Hollywood would recreate it in films, though often simplifying the story into easy heroics. Historians, meanwhile, began to unearth the real accounts, diaries, dispatches, and oral histories that revealed the grit and exhaustion behind the myth. Veterans groups gathered in small reunions, bringing old photographs and unit patches. Some of their children and grandchildren began to record their memories, preserving what the world had once overlooked. By the 1980s and 1990s, the U.S. Army began officially recognizing the Red Ball Express in commemorative ceremonies, museums dedicated exhibits to its convoys, and military academies studied its operations as case studies in rapid supply logistics. What had once been mocked as an impossible gamble was now taught as one of the most brilliant logistical feats in military history today. The roads the Red Ball Express traveled have long since vanished under highways and suburbs, but the idea it represented, relentless motion, unity under pressure, precision under chaos, endures wherever soldiers move supplies through danger. Its spirit rides in every convoy that crosses a desert, every airlift that feeds an encircled force, every engineer who builds a bridge to keep an army alive. And somewhere in the echo of those engines, there remains the heartbeat of men who were once told they couldn't, and proved that they could. They turned laughter into respect. They turned skepticism into strategy. They turned the grind of the road into the path to victory. The Red Ball Express was not just a line of trucks, it was the proof that courage, commies in many forms, sometimes wearing grease-stained uniforms, driving through the night, carrying the weight of a world on their axles, and long after the last truck stopped, its legacy still drives the future forward. 1 mile, 1 lesson, 1 memory at a time. The story of the Red Ball Express is not just a chapter in the history of World War II, it is a reminder of what victory truly costs, and what it takes to sustain it. Wars are remembered for battles, for the roar of artillery, the courage of infantry, and the clash of armor. But behind every tank that surged forward, behind every breakthrough that changed the course of the war, there were men who drove through the darkness, carrying the invisible lifeblood of the fight. They had no glory, no headlines, no fanfare, only the road ahead, the weight of fuel and ammunition behind them, and the knowledge that if they failed, everything stopped. The Red Ball Express proved that war is not only won by those who fire the guns, but by those who keep the guns firing. It showed that logistics, the art of endurance, is as vital as strategy, and within that machine, the courage of thousands of African American drivers, mechanics left a mark deeper than any tire track. Their service challenged prejudice and rewrote what the world believed possible. They helped fuel not only Patton's advance, but a quiet revolution of equality and recognition in the vast story of the Second World War. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, yet their legacy moves beneath every modern army that values efficiency, unity, and resolve. The Red Ball Express ran for only 81 days, but in those 81 days, it carried a nation's hope across a continent and delivered the momentum that crushed tyranny in Europe when the engines finally fell silent. The road they left behind was not of dirt or asphalt. It was a road of endurance, of brotherhood, of faith in motion, a road that would never be forgotten.